Hi, I'm Brad Young with the North Carolina Institute of Political Leadership. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Andy Jackson. Dr. Jackson is the director of the Civitas Center for Public Integrity at the John Locke Foundation. And today, in particular, we're talking about the Civitas Partisan Index and what it tells you, what it is, what it's not, and how it can be used by consumers of political information in North Carolina. So thank you so much for being with me, Dr. Jackson.
Thanks for having me.
So tell me a little bit about the evolution of this model. You know, it started as a national model and then it's something that we've started doing in North Carolina. How is that? How have you got involved with it? And how has that process been for you this year so far?
Well, the Civitas Partisan Index was started a little over a decade ago by my predecessor at what was then the Civitas Institute. It's modeled after a similar index put out by the Cook Report, a national index that they do. And we base ours on a similar set of criteria, but because we're looking at a statewide effort, we've essentially scaled everything down one level. So the Cook Report, they essentially look at presidential data and then they compare states or congressional districts to a nationwide average. And in that way, they are not really looking at expected head-to-head outcome, but they're saying this is what this district looks like, this congressional district looks like compared to the nation as a whole. So for example, if you're looking at presidential data, after the last couple of nationwide elections, Democrats did better, even though Republicans won because of the Electoral College, Donald Trump in 2016. The popular vote went Democratic, and they compare how much more or less is this district Democratic compared to the nation as a whole. What we do with the CPI is a similar thing in that we're comparing each of the 50 state Senate districts and the 120 state House districts compared to the state as a whole. And our baseline data is formed by, we start off with the Council of State races each year. And there are 10 of them. North Carolina is a little unusual in that we have a lot of executives who are elected. In most states, there are a lot more appointed positions. We elect 10 different people in the executive branch. So we're somewhat unusual in that way. And then we take those results and we find out what the statewide average is for the last general election in which they were elected, which was 2020 this time around. And that came out to a statewide average in which Republicans won 50.7% of the two-party vote. We exclude libertarians or third-party candidates from the calculation because it kind of muddies the water a little bit. And what we do also is we have about 2,700 precincts in North Carolina. So we go to, and the State Board of Elections keeps this data, it's called the precinct sort file. We go to their precinct sort file because by law, sometimes people don't vote by precinct, they vote early by mail or they vote at an early voting site. But by law, within 30 days of the elections, the counties have to sort that information back to the precincts. So we essentially, we do a statewide analysis of the voting average, and then we analyze every single precinct based on those same 10 districts to see how they're the same or different compared to the statewide total. Once we have that, and we did that data work last summer where we assigned data to every precinct, then once we get the district information from the state, from the General Assembly, once they draw the maps, then we can assign each of those individual precincts to a district. Sometimes that's difficult because one of those little weird things is that sometimes there are districts that exist on a county board that don't exist in the legislation that drew the maps. And so we have to kind of use a kind of a Rosetta Stone type thing where we figure out, well, what do they mean when they write, precinct 12 in some county? Then we have to go and look at their maps and, oh, what they mean is, the Norwood precinct, for example. So it gets complicated, but once we get all that done, we're able to find out how this district votes. And then essentially what we do is we subtract the Republican total from that precinct from the statewide average. Actually, I take that back. We subtract the statewide average from that and get the index. So for example, if the district is 54% Republican, then we subtract the statewide average and we say that is, on our Civitas partisan index, roughly a Republican +3 district, which we would label as a lean Republican. So it's a little more Republican than the statewide average.
And I'll go ahead and toot your horn for you. As far as the last election in 2020, I think the 94% accuracy in those races. But one of the caveats that you include is that it's not a predictive model. Can you explain a little bit of why it's not predictive and what's included and what's not?
Yeah, well, and the reason that it's accurate is that we're using data that kind of follows the trends of that particular district. So we're using kind of a past as prologue model, so to speak. And the reason that we don't call it a predictive model is that, that creates the baseline. It's kind of like in sports where, you usually know who's going to win a baseball game or a football game before it happens, because you generally know which team is better, has better players in the positions, but that's not everything. You still have to play the game, and there are still upsets. Similarly, in elections, there's other factors than just the baseline tendency of voters in the district. If one candidate happens to be much better for whatever reason, it's a better public speaker, has better connections to people, is able to raise more money, that better candidate can overcome living in a district or running in a district where they have kind of a baseline disadvantage. And as I've mentioned before, money is certainly a factor, although I will, slight segue here, I will say that we have, in political science, they haven't determined the causal direction of money. Does money make a candidate better, or do better candidates attract the money? That hasn't been fully resolved yet. So that's an interesting question about the relationship between money and electoral outcomes, and we're certainly not going to answer that question here. But there's factors like that. And also, the one last thing I should mention is there's this kind of tidal phenomenon. What is the political atmosphere at the time? The CPI tends to be more accurate in presidential election years because you have a fuller set of voters and it's kind of like a baseline. These midterm elections have that factor where the president's party tends to do a little worse, sometimes a lot worse, and that will affect the accuracy. So I'm a little worried that we won't be quite as accurate this year just because it is a midterm election, but we were 90% accurate in the last midterm, so our numbers are still pretty good.
And that kind of dovetails into my next question, was just, how has this year been with all of the, the redrawing of the maps and then the redrawing of the maps that has gone on as a result of some of the court orders? There's been a lot of chaos for candidates. I can only imagine studying the districts has been that much more difficult.
It has been, in one sense, in the fact that it just takes more work. As I mentioned before, the baseline data where we were assigning the tendencies to each precinct, we did that last summer before any districts were drawn. It's nice to have interns. Well, I should say pluses and minuses with interns. Pluses being, I hope no interns watch this video. The plus being that, it spreads out the labor, many hands make light work. But also, when you're asking people to do data work, I have a colleague of mine, Jim Sterling, who I work with. If we're doing the data, we have enough experience with the data that it's kind of like other matrix. I just see blondes or brunettes when I look at the data. I don't see numbers anymore. So when we're doing the data, we see when something's not quite right, and we notice something not quite right. And the interns just don't have that experience. I mean, and certainly they're doing their best job. So it does take some baseline knowledge, and we actually had to make a correction after we did all that data entry because the numbers weren't adding up correctly. We're about 300,000 votes off. And it was probably a big enough thing to affect the index. We had to go back, the two of us, and redo everything late in the summer, which took more work, but you had to do it because we want accuracy. And of course, we did the whole index after they drew the maps, and the maps got overturned. And so we had to redo the same thing. But the good news is because we had that baseline work done, we were able to get the redrawn maps done probably in about a day and a half work. And it took us a long time because we're still kind of old school. We manually enter that stuff in. And obviously the big minus with doing that is it takes more time. There are ways to do that with a more automated system. But sometimes, once again, just like with using the interns, if that sometimes some problem will slip through and you won't even notice it until afterwards. So it's worth us, at least now, until we find a foolproof way to automate that thing. I think it's pretty good that we still do that manually, and it helps us correct errors on the fly as we need it.
Well, Dr. Andy Jackson, thank you so much for being here with us today to talk about the Civitas Partisan Index and all the great work that you've done in uncertain times of political information. And I think that's a ringing endorsement for your internships for the future as well. So maybe you'll get a few more applicants.
They do great work in general, yes.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your time, and we hope to see you again soon.
All right, thank you.